Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
Lama to boot, back with the Everyday Sublime. And what a day. Just for our listeners, we're recording on November 6th, 2024.
That's right.
That is the context in which we've woken up, and our pain is with you all. We're not going to spend a lot of time going into that, but we obviously just had a little support group for the two of us before the call. So hopefully you all have your own support systems and people you love and care about, and are I don't know, whatever. You have the words for it. But what a good day to talk about the Everyday Sublime. And so we'll start with the epigraph here. Good snowflakes, they don't fall anywhere else, by Layman Pong. And this chapter, I feel like was a super practical chapter and incredibly dense. And I think you and I both felt like we could just read this chapter beginning to end because there's so much gold in here.
Yeah, agreed. This is probably like the one that I would, as a whole, that I would like revisit, I feel like, the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. So he starts out here talking about all the things that he doesn't want out of his meditation. The first sentence is meditation originates and culminates in the everyday sublime. And then he goes into all the things that he doesn't want out of his practice. Like he's not interested in reciting mantras, visualizing Buddhas or mandalas, out-of-body experiences, telepathy, lucid dreaming. And the last thing he says here is like, he's not interested in letting his consciousness be absorbed into the transcendent perfection of the unconditioned. And he says meditation is about embracing what is happening to this organism as it touches its environment in this moment. I love that sentence. I mean, that's like such a simple description of what meditation is. And he goes on to say, I do not reject the experience of the mystical. I reject only the view that the mystical is concealed behind what is merely apparent. That is anything other than what is occurring in time and space right now. So I feel like that's a good lesson for me today too. You know what I mean? Like this is the everyday sublime, whatever's happening. And I think that's just a good reminder too of like, no one can stop you from meditating. I think that's something I tell people a lot of times is just whatever the circumstance is, you can still practice. But I think what it highlights when the external environment is not what we prefer is it highlights the actual challenge of meditation. The challenge is that it isn't always awesome, and it isn't always what we prefer, and it isn't always in the container we prefer, but we still have to cultivate that kind of awareness and that attitude of openness and compassion. And I think it's important to note, like, no one can impede your meditation. You can make it harder on yourself if it doesn't fit your expectation. And when things don't fit the expectation, it seems harder, but that's not the meditation. That's our preferences. And that practice of being able to do it, even if it's a situation we don't like, is the practice of meditation. I think a lot of people feel like it's a failure, in those moments.
Right. Yeah. I mean, our own internal world is maybe the only thing we really have control over. I guess this line of thought also brings up, the sort of separation between what's going on externally and our own response to it. We'll get to that later in the chapter, I guess. That point comes up, but just that sometimes we almost like equate our reaction with the stimulus or the stimuli itself, when in reality, with practice and reflection, it's like they're actually, whatever our reaction is to the external world is different from the world. It's not the same thing. I don't know if I'm kind of stumbling over that a little bit.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think everybody has real life examples of that too, because I think we all know people, and this is also a nod towards the fact that sometimes people just naturally develop these skills. But I mean, like, I think we all know and admire people who, under pressure, are cool and collected and handle things with kindness and intelligence. And I always want to be like that when I grow up. You know, like I still hold out hope that I might be someday. You know, but yeah, and some of those people are meditators and some are not, but some people just naturally are able to cultivate the skills to do that. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you're talking about, like recognizing, like, you know, whatever's happening in the external world, this is my domain in here. And I mean, I'd be able to control the physical aspects of it, but I can definitely have a tremendous impact on my responses.
Yeah, and I mean, we probably need that kind of perspective and actual practice more than ever.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say. I mean, the quicker that we can go ahead and like shift into that gear and continue to be people who have some kind of positive impact on society, probably the better.
Yeah, it's true. And so I think that the part of why this chapter, that is really the first chapter about meditation, I think, is called the Everyday Sublime. You know, it's about switching our view to seeing whatever we encounter as differently than we might now, you know, and hit the framework here he's using is this everyday sublime. So, as I said, he doesn't reject the experience of the mystical. He rejects only the view that the mystical is concealed behind what is merely apparent. He says, the mystical does not transcend the world, but saturates it. The mystical is not, the mystical is not how the world is, noted Ludwig Wittgenstein, but that it is. So that the world is what is considered mystical. I'm going to read a little bit more here. He says, as understood by Edmund Burke and the Romantic poets, the sublime exceeds our capacity for representation. The world is excessive. Every blade of grass, every ray of sun, every falling leaf is excessive. None of these things can be adequately captured in concepts, images, or words. They overreach us, spilling beyond the boundaries of thought. Their sublimity brings the thinking, calculating mind to a stop, leaving one speechless, overwhelmed with either wonder or terror. Yet for we human animals who delight and revel in our place, who crave security, certainty, and consolation, the sublime is banished and forgotten. As a result, life is rendered opaque and flat. Each day is reduced to the repetition of familiar actions and events which are blandly comforting, but devoid of any intensity we both yearn for and fear. To experience the everyday sublime requires that we dismantle the perceptual conditioning that insists on seeing ourselves and the world as essentially comfortable, permanent, solid, and mine. It means to embrace suffering and conflict rather than to shy away from them, to cultivate the embodied attention that contemplates the tragic, changing, empty, and impersonal dimensions of life, rather than succumbing to fantasies of self-glorification or self-loathing. This takes time. It is a lifelong practice. I am glad we're working on this one today.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I almost feel like we might as well just alternate and finish reading the section. I mean, because we could comment, but it's good stuff. And like, it almost, you know, I mean, he says it so well. So, okay, I'll just keep going there. So as we have seen, this entails 1, an open-hearted embrace of the totality of one's existential situation. 2, a letting go of the habitual reactive patterns of thought and behavior triggered by that situation. 3, a conscious valorization of those moments in which in which such reactive patterns have stilled. And 4, a commitment to a way of life that emerges from such stillness and responds empathetically, ethically, and creatively to the situation at hand. So, I mean, I guess, you know, that's kind of like a restatement of the fourfold task in kind of different terms, but like basically is, I guess, you know, kind of a step-by-step of how to come into some direct perception of this everyday sublime. I really like the wording of all that.
Yeah, me too. Because it feels very applicable to my experience right now on the day after the election. But like this open-hearted embrace of the totality of one's existential situation. Like I hear that, and that's challenging. I mean, like, and I don't just mean hard. I mean, that feels like not just a challenge, but like fighting words, like in a sense of like, that sounds hard, but I know that's what we have to do. And it feels particularly hard today because the situation in my environment feels hard today. And that's all the more reason for me to hear this, you know, like this is exactly when the Dharma meets the road, you know, when the rubber meets the road is these kind of times. So like, yeah, and an open-hearted embrace of the totality of one's existential situation, a letting go of the habitual reactive patterns of thought and behavior triggered by that situation. Yeah. Oh, back to the first one, an open-hearted embrace of the totality of one's existential situation. I think part of what's hard when big events happen or changes happen, I think there's always just a period of like, where to some degree, we all have to let go of the resistance to a new reality. Like, because that resisting how things are never really helps. And it doesn't help us come to terms with the right strategies for the actual situation. And so for me, I've come to recognize that there's a period of time where I have to just acclimate to a new situation. And so I think this idea of an open-hearted embrace of the totality of one's existential situation, for me, it happens over a period of time. Like I can be aware right now, yes, that's what I need to do, but it's going to slowly evolve, you know?
Yeah. Well, and you know, another thing I hear in all the language of this too is like there's some broadening of scope, and like to embrace the totality, I think, of our existential condition. One meaning in there is that like there's never just one thing happening, you know, like as much as we might become fixated on one situation or one reality, it's still just part of like a much bigger thing. Like no matter what kind of difficult circumstances going on, you can still walk outside and the world is still beautiful and people are still being nice to each other and all that kind of thing, you know. It's like,
yeah,
I think that's kind of important. Like, I think that's part of the skill of the way he presents like suffering, because it's like, yeah, we have to be aware of suffering and we have to know suffering, but also it's like embracing everything that's part of life. And really like the suffering can only exist in relation to happiness also. So it's all just one big thing that's taking place, you know?
Yeah, and that existential, I think that's an important point because the totality of one's existential situation is much more than the events of today. It's also like,
right.
Like what is like, it's the everyday sublime in the sense that the everyday sublime is not just the details. It's not just the environment. It's not just our own experience. It's the totality. So like, yeah, there is like a wider view there.
And like the thing from the beginning too, right? It's like the fact that any of this is happening is kind of amazing in its own right. You know, I mean, we can always stand back in awe of existence.
Yeah. So we have that open-hearted embrace. We have letting go of habitual reactive patterns of thought and behavior. We have I love this phrasing too, a conscious valorization of those moments in which such reactive patterns have stilled. I like this word, like to valorize. Like, I don't know that I've ever used that word before.
Yeah.
But that is such an important part. Like, I think I'll always use that now when I talk about meditation, because I think for so many of us, like we discount or dismiss the moments where we actually feel the effects of the meditation.
Right.
And maybe it's because they're so subtle or because it's not what we expect it to look like, but like a stilling, you know, the stilling of, is that the phrase he uses? Oh, when reactive patterns have been stilled, you know, it's not like a whole new thing appears and dances around. It's that something has gone away. So it like a lot of times we don't give that any credit or the credit it deserves. So I like the idea of valorizing that, because it's another, like a simple way to put it is just like our brains, I think, are trained to squirt happy chemicals when something amazing happens in our environment, like where we get a thing we like, and we valorize those moments. So yeah, I think another way I would say it is just like we're already valorizing a lot of things in our experience that don't actually help us or don't give us any sort of lasting stability or happiness. So just like we might train in a practice of refuge, which feels weird at first because we don't usually talk about refuge or like think of it as a practice, but we're always taking refuge in things. Similarly, we're always valorizing certain experiences or feelings and that may not help us. So if we can start to become aware of what we valorize, and particularly valorize those moments when we've let go of reactivity, we start to train in ways that are actually effective in the long run.
Yeah, yeah. And then just the whole like to recognize that those moments are not an end, but really a beginning,
Yeah.
of our sort of new way of engaging. Like,
Yes.
I guess that's kind of moving into the fourth one.
A commitment to a way of life that emerges from such stillness and responds empathetically, ethically, and creatively to the situation at hand.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, all that language is great, but to me, like, especially the use of the word creatively is kind of, that strikes the chord for me, like, because as we'll get to later, he gets into like mentioning the arts in this chapter, and just,
Oh,
it's
good
like,
catch. Yeah.
and the idea, like, in a certain way, like everything is art. You know what I mean? If we're like, if we choose to think about it that way, just down to like how we dress, or like kind of the way I think about what he's saying here is like how we choose to speak and act is kind of like living as art. You know what I mean? If you think of a skillful way to say something to somebody in a moment that avoids conflict, or just like whatever. I mean, there's endless examples we could think of, but I love that idea of creatively, or like living in an aesthetic way, because I just kind of feel like if we're geared toward thinking like that, a lot of the other benefits will kind of take care of themselves. You know what I mean? Like, because like we all want beauty, like not in a cheap way, but like to say something to somebody beautifully, like kindness is taken care of in that. You know what I mean? Because it's like giving someone pleasure in a way. Like, I just love that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that creativity also brings up the idea of familiarity. I think that I wouldn't necessarily say those two are opposite, but I think it highlights the need.
Right.
Yeah, it highlights the need to explore and try things that are not as familiar, and there are so many opportunities for that. Like I'm sure I've probably mentioned it on here before, since we have done a lot of shows about the band Fish and improvisation and stuff. But just playing with our experience, in creative ways, it can be really powerful. I just took a walk at like 9:30 at night last night. I just decided I would go out and take a walk. And it was awesome because I never do that. Like I never go take a walk at 9 o'clock at night. And I did. And it was like, it woke me up in this amazing way. And it literally shifted the way I feel about the world and my habits and my place. And it was like something so simple of just going and taking a walk at a different time of day. And so that wasn't even an interpersonal kind of thing. Like you can also, like you said, come up with a different way of saying things to people, or, those kind of things are so powerful. Like when you feel like you would usually respond one way, but you go, you know what, I'm going to just try a whole different approach today. I'm going to play with this reality. Yeah. Like that creativity is beautiful and can be fun,
Yeah, I think that's probably the main reason that speaks to me so much, is that it's like positively giving you permission to have fun with your life. And there's kind of like a sentiment in that like your fun can be deeply beneficial. Like, it's not
Yeah.
just like fun in some frivolous sense. It's like we can enjoy uh, the act of living, and that can have positive effects. Like, I mean, even what you're talking about, like maybe you didn't like interact with anybody directly on that walk, but at the same time, that experience is going to impact, it impacts you. Therefore, at some point, it will impact someone else. Like, just
Yeah.
because, you will interact again.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if someone calls me at a
Um,
time when I would normally be doing something else, I'll kind of recall like, oh, I don't have to stick to the same schedule I always have. And I'm a little more flexible, a
right.
little more agile,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Maybe you want to just kind of keep going with this
Sure. Yeah.
section,
Yeah.
or, I mean, it sets everything up in a good way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so he says, understood in this way, meditation is not about gaining proficiency in technical procedures claimed to guarantee attainments that correspond to the dogmas of a particular religious orthodoxy, nor is its goal to achieve a privileged transcendent insight into the ultimate nature of reality, mind, or God. In the light of the fourfold task, meditation is the ongoing cultivation of a sensibility, a way of attending to every aspect of experience within a framework of ethical values and goals.
Yeah.
Um,
before we go on, I want to highlight that
yeah.
word sensibility, because that comes back a lot in
Hmm.
this chapter. And
Yeah.
it's a word I've never really heard used to describe what we're developing. I'll also throw in, because I know I've mentioned in this season too, how an embodied practice of mindfulness and meditation has a lot to do with the senses, and tuning into the
Mm.
senses and sensory input, not just from outside, but from inside. And I like that that's a root of this word too, sensibility. It's like it's right in that word that we're tuned into our senses.
Yeah. I'm really appreciating it a lot today. That word, I think it's like super accurate. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Sort of suggestive of the fact that like meditation is ultimately like a whole life gesture,
Yeah.
certainly not just like sitting down. It's a sensibility, right? Like a way that we're uh attempting to approach our whole lives, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. I feel like all of this stuff I'm seeing now, like this section sets up the whole chapter, really,
Yeah.
with stuff that comes back.
Do you want to read it?
Um, sure, yeah. So he says, over the course of history, monks and yogins in Buddhist cultures have developed spiritual technologies to a high degree, resulting in levels of mental refinement, control, and absorption that may seem incredible to modern Westerners. Yet, from a dharmic perspective, the value of these attainments lies not in their being humanly possible, but in their contribution to the practice of the fourfold task. It is not hard to imagine being highly accomplished in certain meditative techniques, yet still failing to embrace wholeheartedly the condition of dukkha that pervades the life of oneself and others, still failing to let go of self centered reactions to dukkha, still failing to behold the stopping of such reactivity, and still failing to cultivate a radically different way of being in this world. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I appreciate about that. One is that he's not kind of dismissing uh, all the wide array of technical practices completely, right? He's just kind
Mm-hmm.
of saying the point of them is that they serve the actual existential development of the Dharma, like in the vein of like the fourfold task. Um, and then also it's like pointing out the possibility that it is possible to engage in all sorts of technical formal meditation practice and still fail to have it cross that boundary into like everyday life, or like actually sort of impact our existential condition. We can kind of leave it separate from our being in this weird way.
Yeah. Do you think it's interesting because, like, I guess I'm trying to formulate a way to to say this, but like, if you can cultivate some sort of magical states of awareness or meditation or whatever you want to call it internally, is the error that we don't extend it out from us? Is it kind of like we keep it centered in our own mind and body and then not extend and include others? Like, because I may become very skilled at dealing with chronic pain, my chronic pain or something,
right,
and gain a great deal of insight through working with some sort of chronic physical or emotional pain that I'm carrying. But then when someone else brings their emotional pain into my field of awareness, like I can, want to get them out of there because it's messing up my meditative absorption or something. I mean, do you think there's a like not a spatial boundary, but kind of a spatial boundary, of like not extending that outside of ourselves into the world or other people?
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be definitely a big one of the potential pitfalls. Another one I could see is just simply not not applying the sort of state of experience on the cushion, off the cushion. You know what I mean? Like so it's like a version of what you're talking about, but maybe even a little simpler. It's like you could cultivate like an interdependent temporary state of whatever on the cushion, right? But then you like get up and go into the next room and something, you just could still be totally reactive to, and I mean, some of that's going to happen, right? Like it takes practice to, for us to actually bring the spaciousness into the next situation successfully. And like we're going to fail for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is that we're just paying attention and attending to it and thinking to ourselves, okay, like, is my practice hitting the mark? Basically, is it doing what it's supposed to do? And I mean, but I think probably what you're saying is like the more important one. And like another aspect of that lack of ability to share it or extend it, but not just to people. I feel like it's about, it's situational. Like, what value is any practice that we do that remains unable to relate with the actual situations of life and the world? I mean, it's like if it can't be relevant and if it doesn't inform skillful interaction and that sort of thing, what's the point? But I think it's good to point out these pitfalls, but I would still champion as my main, personally, like my main kind of public policy, right, would be like, we should do the practices. I'm not throwing the practices out yet. Like like my meditation involves plenty of things that Stephen Batchelor is not interested in, and that's fine. But I think the main thing is that we need to make sure that those practices that we choose to do are hitting the mark in this way,
Yeah. And I'll also, this is a good place to bring in the metaphor of the mountain too, where it's like, I was reading a book called Sacred Wisdom about psychedelics and the sacred experience, and really interesting book by a guy from Johns Hopkins, where they do a lot of research into that kind of stuff. And he uses the metaphor of like, all spiritual paths are leading to the same peak of the mountain, but there's all kinds of different paths to get there. And I think we can think of it in terms of like, some people may want the path that's a little more level and steady and gradual. It may take longer to get there, but they don't have to do any, rock climbing or anything. And other people want the challenge and are able and want to have to like hang on to a rope and clamp in and all that kind of stuff. So there's always like, not just like different choices about how to get up, but also different things that match people's capabilities. There may be routes that certain people just can't take or shouldn't take because of some contraindication or another. And there's also certain paths that are probably better. Maybe someone's a botanist and they want to take the path that has the most interesting plant life, or something like that. So, Yeah. Yeah. I just want to bring that up too, because I think that
Yeah,
relates. Like there's all these different
absolutely.
routes to that same peak.
And I mean, I think that right there to me feels really helpful, just in the sense that it helps us keep an open mind that, like, even though we may be following like a Buddhist path with a certain curriculum, so to speak, doesn't really mean that we can't incorporate other helpful things,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yes.
to just keeping in mind that it's all kind of going in the same direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And to continue checking in too. I think another piece of that is continue to check in and see, are the practices you're doing helping now? That's, I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I think I've said it before in this season, but like, I think there's too much always and never in probably in all religions, but I know for sure in Tibetan Buddhism. And I
Mm.
may be going against the company line here, but my take is a practice may work for you for a while, and then the outcomes of that practice may differ over time. You may start to have a
Right.
different outcome. And it's important every day to pay attention to what's working and what's not and adjust
Mm-hmm.
accordingly. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that applies to what meditation practices you're doing too. I think that's
Yeah.
sensible. And I think honestly, that is an embodied practice of meditation itself. Paying attention to,
Mm-hmm.
is this practice I've done every day for 3 years still appropriate for me? You know?
Mm-hmm.
And you could
Mm-hmm.
ask a
Yeah.
teacher, and you should, but you are the final authority.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't really think that goes against the company line, so to speak. I mean, like, I think part of the reason that there's so many methods and practices available in our tradition is because, you know, like, ultimately they all fulfill the same fundamental purpose, is like, and some are going to work and apply for certain periods, and then you shift and move to other things, like, I mean, I think that there's long-standing traditions of people practicing different things throughout a lifetime, and that's kind of like almost like what you're supposed to do. We go through different phases, there's got to be different things that speak to us in different moments, and like, we're supposed to develop, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's like the, certain methods are going to run their course and be left behind because we don't need it quite in that same way anymore, you know
yeah,
that's supposed to be happening.
yeah. And staying, when it's a practice becomes your familiar comfort zone, then that's probably a good sign it may not be working anymore. Like, I think there should always be
Right,
a
right,
little
right.
bit of challenge with practice. Side note, by the way, I don't think we mentioned that we were actually on our second pass on this episode because we went through hours of this yesterday and none of it recorded. And so we're going for part two. But I just want to point out, like, this is very different than our conversation yesterday. And it makes me
It
think
is.
I kind of wanted, maybe after we finish this season, like, next, like once we've gone through all the chapters, maybe do remixes on some of these chapters, like this one for
Hmm.
sure. Like, I would love in 3 months to come back to this chapter with you and talk about it again, and just have
Yeah,
like an
yeah,
alternate mix and see what that's
yeah.
like, because I think it would be fascinating, because
It
there's
is
just
funny.
so much here, and we're
Hmm.
having a
And
totally different
even,
conversation than yesterday.
definitely, yeah, even just one day.
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of a combination of things. I mean, but I do think some of it is like the fact that the content has suddenly become more practical and more real.
Just from yesterday to
Given,
today.
yeah, given
Yeah.
the course of events, because it's like sometimes things do become more real just through simple contrast.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this conversation is now taking place in a kind of a different atmosphere than yesterday. And then also, yeah, I mean, maybe just um, new day, you're going to see different things in it. I feel like
Yeah.
this is kind of like already, not that we have to compare, but I feel like it's better than yesterday,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
I mean, more I don't know, sort of feels like a more forward moving take on it or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah,
guess
so what?
maybe I'll just read,
Go ahead. Yeah. One
just
last paragraph.
may as well finish it off.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So, as a sensibility, meditation enables us to cultivate an understanding of moment to moment experience, much as we develop an appreciation of art or poetry or nature. Grounded in the body and the senses, we value an open mindedness to what is unfamiliar, probe our sensorium with relentless curiosity, listen attentively to what others have to say, are willing to suspend habitual attitudes and opinions, and question what is going on instead of simply taking things for granted. The disengagement of meditation is not an aloof regard or disregard, but a perspective that engenders another kind of response to what is happening. And it begins with the breath, our primordial relationship to the fabric of the world in which we are embedded.
Yeah, so much here that
yeah.
echoes what we've been talking about too. Like I notice the mention of appreciation of art or poetry or nature. And I think like another way to say that is like just appreciating creativity because of what's in the next sentence, which is about like an open-mindedness to what is unfamiliar, which is, I mentioned familiarity earlier as being like something related to, or on the flip side of creativity. And then curiosity, like remaining curious. Like it's funny because like there's kind of two ways we wouldn't be curious. One of them, I think we could say, is like when something's monotonous, we may start to lose curiosity when something's very repetitive or predictable. But there's also a loss of curiosity when things are chaotic, like super chaotic. Like we kind of maybe just burn out quickly and are like, there's nothing there for me to even try to be curious about. It's just too much, like, so there's kind of both ends, like nothing new and novel can make us incurious, and too much unfamiliarity can also start to tax our curiosity. Willing to suspend habitual attitudes and opinions. Ooh, that one's tough, yeah. But I want to actually, I'll say here, I think one thing I would say about this willingness to suspend habitual attitudes and opinions is that I think we relate habitual attitudes and opinions far too much with the sense of self. I mean, they definitely come from a sense of self, but like this is a place where for me, I'm trying to think more of my noble aspirations. I'm not saying I'm noble, but I'm saying the aspirations I have that noble beings have that I want to cultivate. Like that's what I try to think of as a self. Like if I'm going to think about a functional self, to me, it's like that, this set of experiences that I've had, the skills that I've developed, and most importantly, what good I hope to accomplish. And I don't think that habitual attitudes and opinions are necessarily helpful in realizing a deep sense of purpose. And I think, in fact, the more flexible I can be about my habitual attitudes and opinions, the better I can be at bringing my vision of a better world into reality.
Yeah, definitely. That reminds me of just like this simple kind of direct quote that I read, like, of some teacher, Tibetan teacher, on like an Instagram account, but it was basically he was just saying like, if you want to fixate on something, if you want to focus on something, like a sense of self, basically just focus on your Buddha nature instead. That's gonna be a lot better.
Yeah.
Basically, like if you need to focus on something, that's what you should focus on.
Yeah, it makes sense. And we've also, of course, here got the sentence that starts grounded in the body and the senses. That's another thing that I think this chapter just really highlights is this embodied practice. And I know for me, like we did a lot of things in the retreat that were physical. There's aspects of the retreat program that are particularly physical. But I know the way I handled that was to try to kind of disconnect from this experience in this body and replace it with some sort of like model that I was being given, as opposed to understand the inseparability of the two, or understand my own experience as this higher view I was being taught. Like that's where I went wrong, is I definitely didn't see it as like a lesson about what I am. I saw it as a lesson about what I need to be. And I think that was a problem, because it really got me disconnected from an embodied practice. And it for me, it really took connecting with trauma-informed practice and even like just purely kind of science-based meditation, because science, I think, has developed a much better vocabulary in the research to back using the senses and the body as an object of meditation. And that's what revealed to me, I think, what I missed through it in the Buddhist context.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. And it kind of makes me think that some of that is a problem with language. I mean, like, I'm not saying this is the whole problem, and also I'm not a translator, so like, obviously there's a reason that people have stuck with like the word visualize or visualization, but I do think it's a little misleading in some ways, like what you're kind of alluding to. Like, it's easy enough to take it as almost like imagining something different, when I don't think that's always the point of it. I mean, there are times when we're imagining a pretty different image from what we see every day, but the point is that we're supposed to be reframing what we see every day and considering it to be that fundamentally.
Yes.
It is that. And I don't know, I've seen there's some Western teachers in the Nyingma school that I've read some of their stuff, and they have chosen to render this word, rather than visualize, to envision, like an envisioning. Or now, again, like, I'm not trying to start a whole discussion here with that, but I do, somehow that hits a little different to me, because it's like to envision one's own life, as like, envision myself as a deity. It's like somehow like something a little more fundamentally conceptual, or like a view that is not just strictly an image, but it's a way of seeing things,
Yeah. I'm wondering too, because I think maybe when we talked about this before, I think you may have said conceptualize.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really an interesting point of discussion too, because like, if we think of visualize, like, I could see a little difference with envision. Conceptualize, I it's funny because like we generally talk about concepts in like as useful, but like potentially problematic. But but I also wondered, like, because I've thought about it since we talked about it last, and I was thinking like the conceptualize thing, like that may be more useful for me, because the idea when we visualize is some conceptualization of our experience. Like we're putting it in some sort of framework. And like, to your point, like I mentioned to someone the other day about like visualizing all form as Chenrezig, or all form as the guru. Like, and it's not like when you look at your couch, you see Chenrezig faces all over it, like, But I think in a way we kind of think that's what's supposed to happen, like,
yeah, exactly.
But the idea, I think, is more towards that conceptualizing side, because we're conceptualizing our couch as this separate thing, that like as an external object, like I don't know, I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. But yeah, the idea is like when we conceptualize something, we're thinking, we're making a framework for understanding it. And so that's like valorize that we discussed earlier. Like conceptualize is another habit we're always doing. And so to shift, I don't think conceptualize has to be a bad thing. Like we could conceptualize in a more effective way.
Absolutely.
And maybe like saying visualize or visualization or anything with vision, it just implicates the eye faculty in such a way that maybe confuses us a little bit, because like, it's tricky to like think about what it's like to see something without your eyes, or even like to see something without thinking about like a vision, like thinking about, I'm not coming up with the right words, but
yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I feel like the whole point of those practices actually is to employ the conceptual faculty in a beneficial way.
yeah.
I mean, that is the point of it. I mean, and like, it's like, I'm not suggesting to eliminate the vocabulary of visualization or anything like that, because like that is an element of it, but there needs to be, it's like, I feel like we could say more to kind of illustrate all the dimensions of those kind of practices. One of which is a kind of like positive employment of the conceptual habit.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there is a visual element, but then there's also an element where you just are thinking about your whole life differently in a different context. And like, what if kind of like, what if it's like this? Like, what if instead of just, drinking my cup of tea, I'm actually drinking Amrita? Why not? I mean, it's not that, it's just a different way of thinking about everything.
Yeah, this is really big for me. I'm going to need to really contemplate this, because I don't know that I've ever heard conceptualize used as a description of a Buddhist practice, but we obviously are doing that. And I think the fact that vision was included in these instructions for me for so long caused me to think that I wasn't supposed to be dabbling in concepts. I was supposed to be dabbling in something I see. When in fact, like the fundamental difference is shifting how we conceptualize these things, like what the conceptual framework is for these things. And so, this is it's impactful. Yeah.
And I mean, we have so much, I think we do just naturally in our language and in our thinking, we prioritize the faculty of sight and vision. Even just in the way we talk. Like, I mean, we could say exactly what we're talking about right now. And we could choose to say, it's just changing the way you see things. Right. And you know what I mean when I say that. It's not literally like, it doesn't mean that you change the way you see it. Literally. It's the way you like think of it, basically.
What an important dynamic.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all related to, that's why I think like to bring it back to this, like thinking about what words really evoke the right meaning, like this whole thing of like a meditative sensibility. I mean, it's all like really, I think that's important territory. 'Cause like to think of it all as a sensibility feels accurate to me. Like, it's an overall way of seeing things,
Yeah. Seeing things. Yeah.
Right.
with the air quotes. Yep.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, let's jump into part 2. So this starts out talking about the rainy season retreats, which would happen during the monsoon time. And the Buddha and his community would stay in one place during the rains. I think because the roads were muddy and it was probably a difficult time to travel. So they would stay in one place and do retreat and a lot of practice. And Batchelor introduces the idea that sometimes people would ask, why, if the Buddha is awakened, does he still need to meditate? And Gautama gave an answer for his followers to tell people. And that answer was, during the rains residence, friends, the teacher generally dwells in concentration through mindfulness of breathing. For if one could say of anything, this is a noble dwelling, this is a sacred dwelling, this is a Tathagata's dwelling, it is of concentration through mindfulness of breathing that one could truly say this. This passage shows that awareness grounded in the breath is the foundation of all the contemplative tasks taught by Gautama and his followers. At its core, meditation is an existential dwelling within the primary rhythms of the body that link one seamlessly to the biosphere. And dwelling here is revisiting a word that was used in the very first chapter when we're framing up the whole idea of the book. And he talked about dwelling in emptiness, and how the idea that emptiness might be some sort of separate conceptual realm that we have to like depart this one to live in this realm of emptiness is a false view. And in fact, the Buddha viewed emptiness as a dwelling, and meaning like a way to have an embodied existence of emptiness. So I wanted to just highlight that return of dwelling, as a place to exist and be.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the sort of simplicity of all this too. You know what I mean? Not necessarily saying it's like easy, but simple,
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing about dwelling is when he calls it a dwelling, the word is Brahma Vihara, which means sacred dwelling. And so he actually puts it in the family of the four immeasurables. And one of the quotes I have here where he talks about this idea that this is a sacred dwelling, Batchelor says, the sacred is not found in a transcendent realm beyond oneself or the world. It is disclosed here and now once the mind relaxes, quietens, and becomes clearer and sharper as attention stabilizes on the breath. And he highlights that it's only through letting go of the tight grip on me and mine that we begin to recognize nirvana here and now. And the sacred reveals itself to be present, entirely present in any moment, in everything. And again, like appropriate context, like it's not easy to let go of that grip on me and mine. And me and mine includes so many different factors, from habits and preferences and opinions to strategies of dealing with the world and expectations about what should and shouldn't be, and what others should and shouldn't do, and how our society should function. Like all of those things are me and mine. And they're not going to just go away. I think that's an important point. I think sometimes there's some fear in letting go of me and mine that will just cease to exist. But that's not what's going to happen. And I think it's important to know that most Dharma practice is some kind of counterbalance to wrong thinking. And so we're not going to just eradicate the sense of me and mine. And I mean, we could. It's not like it's impossible, but that would be a defect. That's not what's being prescribed here. What's being prescribed here is to let go, work on letting go of that, or loosening the grip. I think the easiest way to say it in the beginning is loosening the grip, and any little bit of loosening we can do on that grip on me and mine is useful practice.
Yeah.
And it is moving upstream too. That's the other thing, like this idea of like, that was mentioned earlier about like going with the stream, a stream entrant, but there's also this aspect of going against the stream of our thoughts, emotions, ruminations, reactivity. So this does feel like some work. It'll take some effort.
I like also where he kind of goes on the next page, just building on that, I guess, in terms of practical application. Like, I guess the reason I find this helpful, or find it helpful to continually come back to kind of like the simplicity of approach and outlook, is just because, as you said, it's like we know this whole sensibility that we're trying to develop, right, is like, it takes some work because it goes against the grain of our habits, right? But to me, because of that, it's kind of helpful to think about like a simple, practical approach. So in other words, it kind of comforts me to know that maybe there's not all that much that I have to do. It's more about, it's not like there's all this stuff we have to go out and do. It's more about a constant attention to a sensibility that is fundamentally actually simple, and a lot of stuff is included in this single kind of gesture. And anyway, so all that to set up that on the next page, he sort of brings up some of these other virtues, like the four immeasurables, right? And we could even maybe just say the general idea of, like what we consider Buddhist virtues, like compassion, right? Kindness, all these things. And he's sort of making the point that these are natural outpourings, natural developments of the sensibility that we're talking about, right? So we don't have to necessarily think so much like, oh my gosh, I have to meditate, and then I've got to go out and find ways to be kind and compassionate and like be generous to people. And like, it's like all of a sudden we've got this huge project, right?
Yeah.
But it's not quite like that, right? And I'll just read this one sentence where he says, referring to all this sort of stuff, he says, they are not calculated desires whose fulfillment is judged in terms of achieving a satisfactory result. So, in other words, like, these are not things that we're going out to do to accomplish something, like to become enlightened or something like that, but rather they are the yearnings of a sensibility that cannot hold itself back any more than the sun can restrain itself from radiating light and heat. That's just great image, right? It's like these virtues that we hold in such high regard are really just natural expressions once we start to develop this sensibility.
Yeah. And I think that relates to, I was going to read an earlier quote too, that I think is very connected. And earlier on, he says, such a world is excessive. It is not manageable. It pours forth relentlessly, voluptuously, but is gone by the time one reaches out to seize and control it. And I think that kind of a view of the excessive, like non-manageable quality of our world is part of what leads to these virtues, to these sacred dwellings. Part of that first sacred dwelling, I think we could say first, of mindfulness. And in this case, he's referring specifically to mindfulness of the breath, but any kind of mindfulness as a sensibility helps us to come to terms with the idea that this world is excessive, and we can't reach out and grab and control anything in any real kind of way, aside from our own responses and interactions with the world. Like, we don't have much impact beyond that. And I wanted to bring up too, just some examples. I think it's helpful. It's been helpful for me to consider some real experiential examples of what it's like to try to reach out and grab our experience. And whether it is like sometimes I work with, like, as an object of mindfulness, like the sense of gravity, or where my body meets the seat or my feet meet the floor. But there's a funny thing about when you put your attention on gravity, like if I use just the example of where my feet meet the floor, like you can't really feel like the place where they meet. There's just sort of a vague sense of connection. And sometimes you're kind of feeling your feet, and sometimes you're feeling the floor, and it's all kind of mixed together and vague. There's nothing really to grab onto. And then there's also like examples of like music and enjoying something that's temporal, like there's really no point that you can grab in a jam you love and say, like, that's my favorite part. Like, I want to hold that part. You can only experience it as a journey, through. And so our whole experience, I think, is like that. And it's worth contemplating that, because, and it's especially worth contemplating like our tendency to think we can reach out and grab things, because I think conceptually, to use that word again, conceptually, I think we can do that. I mean, we may on a surface level understand we can't, like on a very surface level, we kind of understand that we can't, but in practice, do we really get it? Do we really get that we can't grab onto things and hold them and control them? That's part of what a practice of meditation itself cultivates, is an experiential familiarity with the fact that our experience is changing all the time. There's nothing to grab onto or hold onto. And we need to see that directly, I think, to really begin to establish that sensibility that that this is all excessive and not manageable. But that's okay. And the outgrowth of that kind of a view is love and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity. That can be the outcome of that experience. It's not, it's not negative.
Mm.
So then he follows up. Batchelor gives like a short instruction on meditation on the breath. It's interesting to see that instruction in here. It was almost a little bit jarring because it was like the first, like, just kind of not standard, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just a basic meditation instruction. And it was interesting because there's so much profundity in here and a lot of things that are very practical and have helped my practice. But like, that's kind of the most simple thing, was just kind of paying attention to the breath. But where I think he really cut through for me was where he says, yet as soon as you become conscious of your breathing, the breath tends to feel forced and deliberate. You start to think of it as mind rather than an impersonal process. Instead of the body just breathing in and out unprompted, which it does as long as you are not attending to it, you assume control of the process. Now you have to relax your attention, but without losing your heightened awareness of the breath. Pretend that you are waiting, as a disinterested observer, to catch the body in the act of inhaling and exhaling of its own accord. Then suddenly, perhaps with a shock, you will notice the breathing just happening. And the note I made here is like how many potential other naturally occurring processes there are that function just fine on their own, that when we look at them, we think we're controlling them or having some sort of impact on them, that their action is our doing, but mainly just because we're paying attention to them in that moment. And really, like, what stood out to me is like how pompous that kind of a worldview is, and how, there's just so many places where that manifests beyond just the breath. And I think we need to be aware of that, whether it's natural processes of the natural world or whether it's even just other people and the way they're behaving to us or around us. Like a lot of times that has nothing to do with us, but we start, I mean, sometimes it does, but to think that all those processes belong to us, I think we can fairly say is a source of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then also in there is like the challenge to truly be kind of awake and present and paying attention, but not controlling, reactive, like, to really be engaged, so like to not check out, basically.
Yeah. And I think, do you think it's fair to say too that like what that highlights is a latent control fixation? Like,
right.
Like we're just, when we do that mindfulness of the breath practice, we see how much we want, not just think we control things, but want to impact things around us. Like we have an impulse to try to control and impact and change. And in fact, it's kind of exciting to like be able to impact things in our environment. And that makes us think like we're being productive when we impact things in our environment. But I think part of what the sensibility of mindfulness highlights is there's a maybe even greater power in just being able to observe.
Right. Yeah. And then, it's kind of like, if I can't control or manipulate, then I'm just going to check out altogether. So it's kind of coming to that a new place.
Yeah. And he connects this idea of natural process and non-manipulation. He uses that as a metaphor for emptiness. And perhaps it is emptiness.
I like the thing as well about how we may be kind of tempted in a way to think of our breath as just involving, one or two or three parts of the body, but like in reality, it's the entire body that breathes in and out, As you settle into this practice, not only does your mind gradually become more focused and calm, but you notice how the experience of breathing is not limited to the nostrils, windpipe, lungs, and diaphragm. The breath rises and falls as a tidal rhythm throughout the entire body. And then he says, I mean, this is in quotes. I don't know maybe I don't know whose quote it is, but it says,
it's from one of the discourses.
Okay. So it says, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. I shall breathe in and out, calming the body's inclination to breathe.
Yeah, that is the Buddha's words. That is from the Majjhima Nikaya. So that is like a direct Gautama meditation instruction. Yeah, I was just rereading that again. I shall breathe in and out, calming the body's inclination to breathe. Profound. And then he introduces the metaphor of meditator as craftsman. And in particular, he uses the example of a wood turner here. The idea that they know the effects of the slightest movement on the material they're working with. And I think it's cool, the idea that we can become familiar with, or through becoming familiar with the nuances in our sensorium, we can become better at shaping our responses to situations and therefore our experience itself by being more and more aware of the nuances. And I think that the word nuance is standing out to me right now, just because like nuances tend to be subtle, right? Like that's kind of part of the definition. And so same thing with like a craftsman, like you're paying like very close attention. You have very heightened awareness of the subtleties of what you're doing. And that's how, a perfect sphere might be formed out of wood or something. You're really tuned into each of the subtle aspects of what you're working with. And that's what meditation is. And I think that extension of that is also the fact that like the work to be done is the little things. The big things are a lot harder to manage with meditation. And there's no doubt that we get more skillful with big instances of strong emotion or fear or anger or things like that. There's no doubt that we get skillful over time. But the real work to be done is in the much more frequent and subtle changes in our sensorium. And so those things, thinking again in terms of valorizing, like we need to valorize each of those moments where we notice one of those nuances and work with it in a way that's skillful. That is really the development of that sensibility. And he goes on with that metaphor to say it involves an exploratory and potentially transformative relationship within the pulsing, sensitive, and conscious material of life itself. Such embodied attention heightens mindful awareness, intensifies curiosity about and investigation of what is unfolding, stimulates an energetic application to the task, induces a sense of delight in what one is doing, and leads to tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. But he warns us that we can't limit that just to our formal practice. We need to take it into life with us. We need to make it into an applied practice and to generate presence and awareness in every aspect of life. And this is where he introduces what is the foundational, or one of the foundational Theravada approaches, which is just to name each thing we're doing, whether it is I am walking, or I am thinking, or I am eating, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. That is one of the practices that they begin with. It's just as a way of becoming mindful. It's just in the moment, noting each thing that's happening as it happens. And in that way, we, as he says, we aim to integrate mindful attention into the totality of our conscious life. And he also gives here a passage that he says is repeated throughout the canon. They are ones who act with full awareness when leaving and returning, when looking ahead and looking back, when flexing and extending their limbs, when wearing their clothes and carrying their bags, when eating, drinking, consuming, and tasting, when shitting and pissing, when walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking, and keeping silent. And he goes on to again highlight how we can't restrict this to our own body. Our embodied attention also has to extend to the bodies of others. And I think through understanding our own body, we become more aware of other people and the subtleties of their movements and reactions. And then we become better at not just maybe impacting them or controlling their processes like we might think of with the breath, but we become better at just observing those processes and more skillfully responding to them, perhaps without such a inclination to make them change or act certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Part 3?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. I'm going to read at least the first paragraph here. Gautama's teaching originates in opening one's heart and mind unconditionally to the everyday sublime. One starts with what is most close and intimate, the body itself. Then one turns this attention to the hedonic totality of one's experience, the entire spectrum of how one feels in a given situation at a given moment. These feelings, too, are initially registered in the flesh, an uneasiness in the stomach, a warmth and openness in the chest, a constriction in the throat, a stirring in the genitals. At this point, the affective dimension of meditation comes into play. When mindfulness entails a degree of detachment and equanimity, it is not a cold, disinterested state of mind. To know fully the shades and nuances of feelings, one needs first to quieten the inner turmoil so often provoked by them in order to establish a clear, penetrating attention. Cultivating an awareness of feelings is crucial because many habitual reactive patterns are triggered as much by these subjective bodily affects as by the objects or persons we believe to be responsible for them. And this gets right at the idea of us mixing up our reactions with the stimulus. And I think this is really such a useful and practical way of approaching this development of this sensibility, is to start to even just begin to see the daylight between physical sensations and our responses to them, because it's not so much like what other people say or do or things that happen that cause us to react in certain ways. It's usually first how our body responds to situations and then how we respond to our body. And I would also make a note here, just because to be for informed consent, that there's a really famous book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a famous book about trauma. And so it is the case that for a lot of people, putting attention in the body, whether it's on the breath or like on physical sensation, can be triggering. So it's important to note that that's the thing you should be aware of, and it's never, if you find yourself feeling activated in a way that's unhelpful, then it's probably, you need to trust yourself on how far you want to go with this kind of a practice. But I would say that I am of the belief that everyone can practice some kind of mindfulness, but it may look different than other people, and we have to be very aware of our own situation. But I think waking up to these things that precede our habitual opinions and our habitual actions, like what's the physical thing that precedes it? Or another way to say it might be, what's the middle condition? Stimulus, physical, mental action. So like that physical aspect, like what happens there in the middle becomes really important, because we can, like, I think what this is saying, and I believe in my experience, I think what it is you can have something happen externally, have an internal response to it, notice that internal somatic dimension, and then decide you don't want to interpret that as anger, or you don't want to interpret that as resistance. You want to maybe just stay with the physical sensation pre-conceptualizing. And that's a practice that's totally possible and is useful and helpful. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, and something that comes to mind for me is that this may not always be the case in the times where we may choose to express like our aggravation. But I think sometimes we choose to express it, or we choose to say something almost as if that's gonna relieve the discomfort of our reaction. You know what I mean? So I think it's important to keep in mind that it really doesn't.
Yeah.
And it may actually like prolong it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because that prolonging, that reminds me of that 90-second rule about how they found that like the physiological effects, the chemical response to strong emotions in the body generally lasts around 90 seconds. But like for most people, when you hear that, that sounds like totally unbelievable because we'll spend whole days or weeks stewing over something. You know? And
Right.
the idea is like when it's the thinking about it that cues that 90 seconds. You know, if we can just stay with the physical aspect, if we can just tune into the somatic dimension of that, then we don't necessarily start that 90 seconds over. But as soon as the somatic dimension to us becomes anger or becomes, I don't want this, or I have to change this, then that 90, every time there's some thought like that, that 90 seconds starts again and we're prolonging it, you know? So I think it's really important to kind of think, you know, what am I doing 90 seconds after whatever thing happened that I don't want, you know? And if it's thinking about how we don't want it, then you're just going to keep the process. The cycle just continues. You know, it's kind of an interesting, I haven't thought about it like this before, but it's probably a pretty interesting way to frame the idea of the cycle of suffering, samsara too, you know, because it's like you can have a response and then let it go. And then that cycle of 90 seconds doesn't continue. But if whenever you have a response, you cling to it, you know, and you cling to wanting to change it or deny it or repress it or act out on it, all those kinds of things, like they just start the cycle again. And so this is one of those things that when we talk about the credulity gap last week about, you know, like between like helping people to believe what needs to be believed, how that's hard enough. You know, the essential elements. This is one of those essential elements. It's very hard to come to a real experiential understanding that our feelings in our body are not the same as our thoughts about those feelings. And one of his quotes here related to that is, mindfulness allows us to open up a gap between the person's angry words and my feelings about them.
It's good stuff. I might go ahead and finish that little part. Well, okay, so I'll just read the last sentence actually of that paragraph because I think it's helpful. In cultivating this gap, one learns how to dwell calmly and vividly in its empty space, which is the, quote, clearly visible, immediate, inviting space of nirvana itself. So,
I like it.
And then he sort of turns to like some different aspects, or like, I guess, some specific aspects of mindfulness after that, like the power of recollection, I guess, is kind of the main one.
Yeah, and I like this. This is a really great way because he brings up that he says in the discourse, the grounding of mindfulness, this practice culminates in the fourfold task. But he points out we don't meditate on the four tasks as we would our breath. And this is one of the really specific things about Buddhist practice, particularly if you're going to lump it into the religion category. Like this is a common thing that I think needs real clarification and experience with to get. But like I've so often have heard people say in other religions, like, we meditate, like we meditate on the word of God, or we, my meditation is prayer, you know? And so like, I'm not going to dispute their experience with that, but in terms of like the language we're using and how it applies in Buddhism, like we don't meditate on ideas. We don't meditate on like, instructions, you know, like that's not the idea of meditation from the Buddhist standpoint. And I'm saying meditation here particularly because I'm talking about in the moment of a practice of meditation. That would be contemplation, generally, is how we would talk about that. But mindfulness, that word which has taken on so many different meanings and so many different contexts, comes from a Pali word sati, or Sanskrit smrti, which actually means recollection or to remember. And this is important to know because what Gautama said is, what is the power of mindfulness? Here a disciple is mindful. He is equipped with the keenest mindfulness and awareness. He recollects well and keeps in mind what has been said and done in the past. So I think the example that Batchelor provides that resonated the most for me was the idea of like recollecting vows. And he uses the example of like marriage vows, how like you're not constantly thinking about your marriage vows. But you might be in a situation where you see an attractive person who isn't your spouse or your partner, and you recall in that moment your vows. So like the environment becomes, your sensorium becomes your reminder of your vows. And so that recollecting really means like recalling in the moment an appropriate instruction. I think we could also say it's a reminder of your intentions, intentions you've set. And an analogy that came to mind for me for this was just like driving. Like when you're on a road trip, you're not constantly thinking about the directions on how to get there. But when you get to an intersection or a road sign, then you're comparing it to your directions and you recall, oh, I need to take a left turn here, but you're not constantly focused on that. And
Right.
Batchelor says here that this recollective aspect is obscured as soon as mindfulness is understood as simply being fully attentive in the present moment or remaining in a state of non-judgmental awareness, neither of which would seem to have much to do with remembering something said or done in the past. So the intention is that. The intention is being fully attentive and present in the moment or remaining in a state of non-judgmental awareness. That's the intention. So that's when we're doing it, that's also mindfulness, but we're not recalling it in that moment. We're just living our intention. So it's almost more like attention. Like mindfulness, I think we could say like includes intention and attention. Like there's an intentional aspect, which is like what I plan to do or what I hope to do or what I know would be the most beneficial. But attention is just doing that. And so there's that obscuration of the recollective aspect in the moment of practicing mindfulness. Oh, but one last point I want to make about that is that like that I think is a really great way to meet anything, is to remember that like it can all be a reminder of our intentions. And so that those reminders might include massive distraction or strong emotions. Those things come up. And in that moment, I think a lot of us may react as like there's a big failure that's occurred. But it's so part of cultivating mindfulness is seeing those moments of distraction or not acting in alignment with our intentions, seeing those as the reminder, turning them into a recollection, recognizing them as positive, not the action that was potentially negative, but the recalling, seeing that as positive, and mindfulness itself. Like that is mindfulness. As soon as you notice you didn't do something that you wanted to do, you are mindful. And that is good, and you can make a resolution not to repeat the bad behavior or whatever, not bad, but the unhelpful behavior. But at the end of the day, that is mindfulness. That's the recollective aspect of mindfulness. And as long as you're not resting in a state of, perfected mindfulness, you're going to have a whole lot of those recollective moments. And that's good. Valorize them, funny. To use the word, valorize those moments.
Valorize, yeah. It makes me think of just like, if we say, oh, I forgot to call so-and-so, I was supposed to call so-and-so. Well, actually you just remembered to call them.
Yes.
Yeah. That kind of, just kind of how we relate to the situation. It's like that. I feel like that does matter though. We can get so discouraged with ourselves unnecessarily.
Yeah, for sure. This is all like really the context here is in the relation to the fourfold task to meditation, and recognizing that like the fourfold task is the framework. Meditation brings about and makes it easier to accomplish the fourfold task. The fourfold task, as Batchelor says, provides meditation its reason for being, raison d'être, if you will. But yeah, so this is like the fourfold task. Like and meditation and their relationship. I'll read the last paragraph here. He says, to ground mindfulness in the fourfold task means to keep these ideas in mind and apply them to illuminate whatever is taking place in our experience at a given time and place. In this way, the fourfold task serves as a framing device that provides meditation with its raison d'etre. When the grounding of mindfulness... I'm just trying to be culturally appropriate. When the grounding of mindfulness describes mindfulness as the direct path to nirvana, it affirms that paying embodied attention to life leads to a falling away of habitual patterns, which leads to a nirvanic moment when we realize the freedom to respond to life unconditioned by our longings and fears, which opens up the possibility of living sanely in this world. Nirvana is reached by paying close, uncompromising attention to our fluctuating, anguished bodies and minds and the physical, social, and cultural environments in which we are embedded.
Good stuff.
I think this is probably a good place for us to stop,
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's bid our listeners adieu. We hope that they have a good raison d'etre.
Yeah, it's like a little French lesson here.
All right. We'll see y'all next week. Peace.